Welcome back to another episode of Detonation. We have a very special guest today, straight from the UK, someone with an actual accent I can understand. Nah, just making fun of my American friends there. It's good to have a familiar accent, though. It's David Wood. He's very special. He's the chair of London Futurists, former director and secretary at Humanity Plus. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you, David Wood, to come on Detonation and to give your wisdom over to this platform.
It's my real pleasure to be here, Steele. Thanks for inviting me.
No, it's really no pleasure, and I watched you on the Futurist New Deal podcast, and I thought that was a really good debate between you and a really good discussion between you and Ben Zion. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about your head and and sort of what you're thinking on transhumanist issues. So firstly, I wanted to get into a little bit about who you are and kind of what your ideas are. So why did you get into transhumanism? Where did that come from in childhood? Is it out of sci-fi? Is it out of a traumatic event? Is it out of exploration of the universe or respect for nature? Where did you get that sort of inspirational where was the catalyst?
Well, science fiction is in my background, certainly. At one stage, I think I'd read every science fiction book in the junior section of my local village library. It was more triggered by my studies in industry when I was working in the mobile computing and smartphone industry back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I saw the trajectory on which technology was moving, that it was going in this kind of exponential curve. It starts slow and then it starts tilting upwards. I saw that what was happening in the world of computing was likely to be repeated in many other fields of technology. And I was guided in that by a couple of books which in various ways changed my life. Eric Drexler's book on nanotechnology made me think, wow, all these amazing things might happen. Then I came across Ray Kurzweil, not The Singularity is Near, his more famous recent book, but I read The Age of Spiritual Machines, which he wrote in 1999. And it spoke to me, first of all, as a technologist, but also as somebody who was concerned about the future of humanity. Already, I was thinking hard that the world seems to be on a mixed course. It has potentials for great dangers, but potential for great wonders. And Ray Kurzweil's book spoke to me there. And just to finish this introduction off, the thing that really pushed me from being an armchair transhumanist, as it were, into being an active transhumanist was the book by James Hawes, Citizen Cyborg, which I read about 2005. And in there, he talks about how democratic societies must respond to the possibilities of enhanced humans in the near future. And he explains, politics has been split along left and right. It's also been split along morally conservative and morally liberal, but that's going to be overtaken by a new division. And that division is between people who want to suppress technology and keep humans more or less in their current state, bioconservative on the one hand, versus others who see the positive transformational potential of new technologies and who want to intelligently take advantage of that. He said, if you don't get involved, we risk letting the bioconservatives and others steer politics in a wrong direction, which will be to the detriment of all of us. So that led me to look online to try and find other transhumanists. I found the website of the World Transhumanist Association, as it was known then. It's since rebranded to Humanity Plus. And it said, well, there's a group of people in London who meet in a pub in Holborn called the Penderel's Oak every so often. So I found them eventually, took a couple of attempts. And the more I talked to them, the more I thought, actually, this stuff's really important, more important than most of the discussions going on in London, frankly. A lot of things being discussed all the time, how to make loads of money, how to have an interesting startup, how to develop your technology. Yes, but actually the humanitarian or the transhumanist possibilities of this technology, the way it could make society much better and save society from the threats, that's what's led me here.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's a good journey. And, the World Transhumanist Association or Foundation or whatever, that's Nick Bostrom. And Nick Bostrom is key to a lot of the fundamental writings that we all lean on when we're talking about these conceptions. So that's that's really cool. Eric Drexler's Eric Drexler's nanobots. He's probably a little ambitious sometimes in his timescales, but I have no doubt that a lot of those technologies are on their way. They're coming, and I think they are going to be absolutely fundamental to changing the landscape. And Nick Bostrom is interesting. You talk about him because he focuses on the positives of technological change, but he also concentrates on existential crises and how to overcome them, or defining what they are, which is just something that you emphasize, that you focus on as well. What do you see as some of some big existential threats that are coming down the pipeline, if any?
So to frame this, I'd say I'm more optimistic than pessimistic, in the sense that if I look ahead to the middle of this century and I imagine the range of possible future scenarios, more of them are wonderfully positive than negative. I say about 60% chance by the middle of the century we'll be living in a sustainable superabundance. But there's also quite a high likelihood, I say about 30%, that one of a number of things will have gone badly wrong with society. It might be as straightforward as a nuclear war, which I used to worry about when I was a student. That was a great deal of discussion then. We seem to have avoided it for the time being, but the threat's still there, especially as the technology is in the hands of more nations and even sub-nation states, groups of people who are angry and upset with the world, and who knows what they might do. I'm very concerned too about another possible existential threat, which is climate change. It's not so much today's climate change I worry about, and that is serious. It is causing, as you know, in Australia, unprecedented extremes of weather. And we can't pin any one extreme in weather to climate change, but overall the odds are higher. But it's not today's climate change. If I go back to this exponential curve that I was talking about earlier, it's where it might take us, perhaps sooner than we expect, due to the same kind of positive feedback cycles, although in this case the outcome of the positive feedback would be very negative. So I think that deserves attention. But then there's the potential of AI being increasingly misused. And we already are seeing outcomes of misuse of artificial intelligence in our social media. For example, Facebook and YouTube are set up as commercial entities. And of course, the founders of these organizations have strong humanitarian instincts, but the reality of the technology is often pushes us against our better instincts. So many discussions on Facebook are quite emotionally charged. Why? Because in a sense, Facebook thrives on people engaging, and what makes people engage is a surge of emotion. And so it's already pushing people away from the better angels of our nature often, and letting more of the inner demons come out. And this is an example of how technology itself is neutral in what it can do, either wonderful things or bad things, but if we're not careful, the bad will dominate. And what we're seeing today with the distortion of people's free will, which is happening to an extent by clever advertising, clever marketing, it's leading us from time to time to buy things we probably shouldn't buy, to click on links we probably shouldn't click on, and maybe even to vote for people we shouldn't vote for. What we're seeing today could be 10 times or even 100 times worse in the future if AI becomes more powerful and political leaders or sub-state groups use it to manipulate the rest of us for their interests. And that could get worse and worse the more powerful technology goes. Eliezer Yudkowsky has a phrase which he dubs Moore's Law of Mad Science. It riffs on the idea of Moore's Law, which is every 18 months, computing technology is roughly twice as powerful. He said something like every 18 months, the IQ necessary for somebody to destroy the whole world comes down by a few points. That is, you get an angry but clever person who is deeply alienated from the world, deeply upset for various reasons, and instead of just grabbing an assault rifle and shooting far too many people already, they might grab a hold of a much more powerful technology. Not yet an atomic bomb, but in the future, who knows? And they might also do huge disruption to our cyber structure. So AI by itself is going to make people more powerful, but power doesn't necessarily lead to more goodness. That's why we need to set the much more positive techno-progressive vision, along with some constraints on how this technology is distributed and can be accessed and can be assembled and deployed.
Yeah, and that's true. And I remember in another podcast you did, you talked about North Korea having quite capable cyber capabilities, and I've always said that, and people have kind of laughed at me because they only see Kim Jong-un walking in a room with these old 90s computers, but that's not the truth. The truth is that they get some from China, but they do have sophisticated cyber. So the state actors, that's the argument, that these can go up to the state actor levels. And there's got to be some sort of international regulation, international law and order on this. Otherwise, you do end up with an arms race, or you do end up with some sort of destructive progression, and that's not what we want to achieve. We want a safe, ethical AI that's produced within reason, and we only have one chance a lot of the time for some of this AI and some of these technologies to get it right, to lay out the frameworks, and when they're switched on or when they're delivered into the ecosystem, I mean, that'll be it. Especially when we're talking about general AI or super AI or some sort of cognitive AI or something without the correct parameters. I mean, this is not good. And I'm glad you mentioned as well the IQ issue, the access to information. Already that's come down. Already, if you look around your cities in any modern city today, kids have iPads. I mean, that is a transhumanist tech. That's fundamental. Like they're on these elegant machines from as young as you can get, but you go back 100 years, you go back 30 years, and this was science fiction. Totally, it's becoming integrated with the human species. We're merging already. This is just external, not internal, but and that's where we talk about Neuralace and all this other stuff. But yeah, that's so many great points in there. Thank you very much for bringing that to light. But on this show, we want to talk about techno-progressive goals and how to actually achieve some of that and work towards some policies. So you're in the UK there, and you have a techno-progressive roadmap for the UK 2019, where we're at now, to 2035. What was the inspiration? Who helped you do this? What is it? Give us a rundown, David Wood in the UK.
So it's my view that we need a powerful vision to help us escape from our day-to-day concerns. Most people do focus on the present, of course. It demands attention, but sometimes we need to raise our eyes and see the bigger horizon. And the view is that if we can pick out a number of goals, not to be done in the next week or even the year or even within the current electoral cycle, say 5 years, we can pick something, a time horizon that's further away, but still within people's thinking conception. So we thought the year 2035, which is 15 years into the future, 15 and a bit, and a number of goals that actually could be achieved by then if society gets itself together. If society does set its mind on things, tremendous progress can be made, as we can sort of see from, in a bad sense, from what happened in wartime. So much progress and so much technology with an existential threat against a country in that stage. So let's set out a vision. I was also partially inspired by meeting a bunch of parliamentarians in the UK's Parliament. They have set up something called an all-party parliamentary group on longevity. So it's mainly people in our upper house, that's the House of Lords, the people who are experts. Some of them are former politicians, but there were some people from the lower house, the House of Commons, mixing there too. And they have set up a goal, which at first sight seemed impressive, but on second sight isn't ambitious at all. They set the goal that in 2035, that the health span, the average health span of people in the UK will have been raised by 5 years. And so that's what they want to work towards. And in one sense, it's ambitious because sadly, the average health span in the UK is actually slightly moving downwards. And if I can just explain that, health span is the amount of time in your life in which you can live happily, independently. You're not dependent on regular medical assistance of one sort. It also can be measured slightly differently, but with roughly the same results as the amount of time somebody would say that they evaluate their own health as being good or very good, as opposed to poor. And it works out that although the average lifespan in the UK is somewhere in the late 70s, the average health span is 63.1 for a man, 63.6 for a woman. So when they said they're going to raise it by 5 years, that's already bucking the current trend, in which it's actually sadly moving slowly downwards. But I thought, that's not taking the full exponential technologies into proper account.
Yeah.
So after some discussion with some of my colleagues in the Transhumanist Party UK, we said, let's set the goal for 90. That seems possible if we can truly take advantage of the things that all transhumanists know about: regenerative medicine, 3D bioprinting, using AI to have a much deeper analysis of the potential for human health. And on that basis, we thought, well, of course, we need to think about a lot more than just physical health. Even more important, arguably, is the mental or emotional health. And there's so much, sadly, so much mental ill health or mental unfitness these days, which is causing many worse problems than other circumstances. So we picked a goal for that as well, that by 2035, 99% of people would report their mental health as being good or very good. And they wouldn't report that they're deeply troubled, often by suicidal thoughts or depression or alienation. So it started from there. And people who work with me in various ways include Chris Montero, who also runs the H+pedia project, Julian Snape, longtime UK British transhumanist, Matthew Goslin, who's a French person but lives in London. There's Alexander Karan, who is British but is briefly on a secondment overseas in Canada. And then a whole bunch of people online. When I posted the initial draft on Facebook, a whole bunch of people came up with interesting comments. And as a result of that, we have iterated the goals. And I'm sure they'll iterate again. But we've ended up now with 15 such goals. We want to change the political thinking, make all politicians of all parties take these ideas into their consideration.
That's awesome. Yeah, it covers robotics, biotech, neurotech, green tech, AI, and more. It's really interesting, the UK roadmap, and it's good to hear so many people are being involved with this. They're energized by this, and even politicians up at the House of Lords are starting to think about these things. Even though that these things, it's the NHS. I mean, it's a mess. I mean, it's an ongoing disgrace in that country. Should it be privatized like the railroads were and become really super inefficient, or should it be more nationalized? And it's a mess. And I can see how the health span of the UK has reduced. I can really see that. But regardless, the UK is still a vibrant country. There's still a lot of great people in the UK. There might be a way to turn some of these things around, and hopefully that you and this roadmap put some energy back into the ideas and some life into the ideas that are emanating from the Parliament right now. Because all we ever hear from down here is Brexit. I mean, no one's talking about health or lifespan or roads or, infrastructure in the UK, whatever. But anything fundamental. I mean, it's all just Brexit, and it's good to see stuff like this, because hopefully, it's a road bump, it gets over, and then this is a time when everyone's bickering and fighting that you could actually infuse fresh ideas.
Exactly.
The goals are new levels of individual flourishing, new levels of social flourishing, new levels of international flourishing, new levels of environmental flourishing, new levels of cosmic flourishing, and new levels of political flourishing. So, Jose Cordero started his own party in Spain there. You're essentially doing the same thing. I mean, it's starting to pop up. do you think it's achievable, any of these outcomes?
Absolutely. So, but it's going to take time. Jose Cordero had a very energetic campaign in Spain. In the end, although I think there was maybe about 8,000 votes were cast in his favor. I may have got that. It's disappointing. He was disappointed, and we were all disappointed. So it shows that the course of creating a new party is hard, frankly. And it might work out over a 15-year time period. We look in the UK at other examples of minority parties which have gradually influenced politics, such as the Greens here, which for a long time did nothing, but they have at least one member in the national parliament, and there are several others in the European Parliament. But that's not necessarily the way we think we'll go. We are interested in influencing people in all parties because, frankly, in all the major parties, there are people who think quite seriously and quite constructively sometimes about all of these issues. They won't all think about all of the issues, typically, so some of them might be concerned about some of the issues. And we want to strengthen these people in all parties if they are positive forces for a better techno-progressive vision. And perhaps our party, therefore, will just act as a think tank, activists doing campaigns which inspire others. Although there also is the possibility that if things don't change enough, provided some of the electoral system gets revised and we change from what we have in the UK currently, which is a first past the post system, which leads people to be very nervous of voting for minority parties. The fear is that if they vote for a minority party, that will be a wasted vote, and they'll let somebody that they dislike intensely come in. And so they often therefore vote for what they might think is their second or third best choice instead. And this makes it really hard on the whole for new parties to break through. Now, there's a big move in the UK to transform that. People tried about 10 or 15 years ago and that got nowhere, but there's a new mood to change that too. And that's one of our goals, not for 2035, but one of the interim goals for 2025 when we're talking about transforming the political situation. You mentioned the 6 spheres in which our 15 goals are grouped. And that last sphere, the sphere of improved political flourishing, one of the goals is that we will in the UK respect and admire our politicians. We'll no longer see our politicians as being self-serving and divisive and incompetent. And how we're going to get there is a number of things. And one of them is this interim goal. And by the way, all the 15 goals for 2035 have got 2 interim goals for 2025. One of them for 2025 is that we will abolish this first past the post system, and we'll therefore allow more people to cast what they would see as an authentic vote. So I'm a big fan of this ranked choice voting, which I see has been adopted by other transhumanists elsewhere in the world too. We need to get the rest of the world to adopt that as well.
Yeah, the Australians pretty much have ranked choice voting, and it does really well here because you really vote for who you actually want as opposed to the lesser of evils. And yeah, you end up with a political duopoly like in the United States, where Republicans and Democrats, the only challenge they ever faced was from the Whigs. I mean, who remembers the Whigs? I mean, not me. So but this argument about in the UK especially about the Labour and the Tories. I mean, Brexit Party, even though it was a protest vote, it was Europe. You can see that the electoral mass is trying to say we're sick of these two parties, but they're scared to actually do anything about it. But they are trying to send a message that there's a whole bunch of issues, 21st century issues, which neither of these parties are addressing. And David Cameron is a genius because by throwing Brexit in the mix, I mean, he sent everyone back 50 years to argue about Brexit when really then they can get away with ignoring some of these other larger issues which you're talking about. But the population will only buy that for so long. They'll only buy it for so long, and then once these issues are nipping at the heels, then they'll have to change again. And you might see that, and you won't have you won't have the luxury if there's a hard Brexit to experiment with protest votes in Europe anymore, and it'll have to come down to not county. Where are you? UK. You'll have to come down to village levels or the local level, like a municipal elections or local elections, and this is going to have to have a change, and the UK Transhumanist Party will have an impact in saying that these are the actual policy issues that people want to talk about, because this is 21st century issues. This isn't, I don't know, 19th, 18th century industrial law reform anymore. I mean, we've done that.
It's a vision of the future rather than a vision of going back to some element of the past. People are feeling deeply uneasy about society. Many people perceive they are somehow being left behind. They're seeing that others apparently are doing very well, but they feel that there isn't a fair opportunity for them to have what they see as a reasonable stake in the present society. Therefore, they're thinking, let's try and find a simpler baseline. So there are lots of people looking at elements of the past. We need to make them instead look at elements of a better future, because frankly, going back to the past isn't going to satisfy anybody. It's a misdiagnosis of the cause of our problems. The cause of our problems isn't an international situation with Europe. It isn't that there are too many immigrants or whatever. The real cause of our problems are not taking full advantage in a techno-progressive way of the fruits of technology. The way things are going currently, not only are health spans going down, but many measures of inequality are rising too. And certain measures of equality are fine. In fact, certain measures of inequality are important to a functioning society, but it seems to have pushed too far, and it's pushed many people into a very uncomfortable situation, both in the UK and overseas.
I agree. And one of these levels is social flourishing. In social flourishing, in a world of increasing automation, how are you going to sell this idea that automation is good? A lot of the rhetoric is protectionist language. It's bring the jobs back. It's China's stealing our manufacturing. It's all this sort of stuff. And then when they do come back, I mean, it's all automated anyway. But in the increasing automation and social flourishing, how do you marry the two, and how do you sell it that this is a good thing as opposed to a bad thing? I mean, you guys are, when we talk about Luddites, I mean, we're talking about the UK, we're talking about, cotton mills or whatever, textiles. How do you sell this?
So it's two things. First of all, it's convincing people how much automation can do if we let it. There's a whole argument about, automation is not going to achieve that much, really. It's going to change bits of people's jobs. And of course, people need to retrain a bit. But if they retrain, they're going to be fine. In reality, the possibilities are much more widespread than that, much more wide implications. And we want to convince people of that possibility. So that means educating people, not just about today's AI, which is remarkable, especially what deep learning can do, but what the next forthcoming waves of AI can do. So that's what I did last night. I was speaking at a pub in Chiswick, an event with 50 people in the audience, not about today's AI, but why there's likely to be new waves of AI in the future that are even more dramatic in their capabilities. So first of all, they're setting out the technical possibility. But then, as you said, it's very important that we manage to reassure people that if this disruption happens, they won't be completely left behind and feeling that they are abused. And it ties up with the prevailing philosophy. The prevailing philosophy of society is sometimes called the Protestant work ethic or the Calvinist principle. It is that unless you're working, you are substandard. You are a scrounger. You should be scorned. You should be reproached. And that's a prevailing philosophy which arguably made good sense for most of human history. People should have a pressure to become a contributing member of society and earning money for that. But we need to paint the picture of a very different vision in which robotics and automation are producing enough for everybody, and we don't need to earn money anymore. So that is one of the goals for 2035, that no one will need to get a job, to earn money, in order to have a good basic quality of life. There will be an abundance of the things needed for good food, good accommodation, good education, good healthcare, and a baseline level of safety and security. And various other politicians have been talking about things like a universal basic income. In America, Andrew Yang calls it a freedom dividend. That's part of the answer. But it's not the main part, actually. The main part is simply we should be setting the direction of the economy to lower the prices. So instead of thinking about GDP up, 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 we should be thinking about bringing down the costs of accommodation, bringing down the costs of food, bringing down the cost of education, bringing down the cost of healthcare by various smart interventions. And that's how we should be measuring the health of the society, not by its GDP, nor even by how many people are in full employment. We should be measuring the health of society in terms of how many people are able to flourish every single day. And various countries around the world, and one of your neighbors, New Zealand, has more attention in its economic policies to thinking about the impact on human flourishing and well-being. Of course, economic prosperity is a part of it, but it shouldn't be the lion. It should be the contributor. And it's more important that we reach a higher state of consciousness and a higher state of well-being. So there's the two angles. Talk about the technology, convince people that the technology could change much more than it is doing already. And secondly, talk about a better way to organize society structured around an abundance and a universal basic income and other redistributions of some of the public dividend that is achieved by society.
Yeah, it's really those core transhumanist issues of super well-being, super longevity, and super intelligence. That they're twofold, and they open up different debates on both sides. But there are short-term ways to mitigate all of those. And not that super happiness or super well-being is a bad thing, but it does open its own doors and networks to larger philosophical questions. And and that's very interesting. And the UBI question, it's not socialist when there's nothing else to do. I mean, it's not communist when there's nothing else to do, when you can't do anything more. But that's not where we're at. No one's saying that there won't be, it's a jobless society in the next 3 or 4 years. No one's saying that. There are going to be jobs to do. And even in a post-automated world, there'll be jobs to do. It's just there needs to be a societal shift. And we bang on about on this show about GDP a lot. And how it's a sort of an arcane metric, a way of measuring the economy, and it does need to sort of, we can't go from GDP to this sort of measurement of just energy consumption, because that's not enough. There's human beings here. This sort of Kardashev scale way of thinking either. I mean, it's like, oh, the UK uses up X amount of energy, therefore that's its output. You can't go to these one aggregates. You have to think across a broad spectrum of human health, human well-being, environmental sustainability, how you're doing on the longevity index, how sustainable is your AI progress and development. It's a broad metric of categorization and calculation, but it's something that has to be teethed out, and it has to be actually, I want to go to the World Economic Forum and I want to hear them talking about this, but the problem with the World Economic Forum is it's just stacked with Jamie Dimon bankers and their cadre of foes. And then they all just say, well, it'd be really nice if we could talk about that. In the real world, little boy, we talk about GDP.
So we do devolve back into thinking about GDP because it's such a apparently straightforward metric. Although, of course, there's lots of controversy about exactly how it gets measured. You're right, people have been critical of GDP since famously Edward Kennedy's electoral run for the Democratic Party in 1968, when he has a very moving speech about all that's wrong with the GDP, in terms of it measures things that do not matter, and most of the things that do matter don't get measured by it. No, there is good work in this. We can look at the rather remarkable book by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, about progress and rationality and science and humanism, which I think I've got some criticism of that book, but on the whole, it gathers a remarkable set of data. So he looks there at a couple of proposals for measuring human well-being, one by some academics in Spain and another by some academics in, I think, Holland. And they're a good starting point. Although I think what's missing in both is a sufficient evaluation of the risks of things going backwards as well. Because alongside progress, you often have the seeds growing of deep discontent. After all, if you measured the progress in Europe in the first couple of years of the last century, 1900 to 1910, in many ways things were getting better and better. But it misperceived the risk of what became the First World War. And if you look back, then the trends were there, which should have been setting off much more alarm bells than was actually the case. So my revisions of the work that Steven Pinker and others quote would include also an honest assessment of the risks of doomsday of various sorts. And other scientists do try and keep track of various doomsday clocks. How close are we to Armageddon or something else? And we've got to take them out of the hands of individuals. It shouldn't just be pressure groups of one sort or another who drive these metrics for their own needs. Important though these needs are, we need to have society as a whole having this debate. And it won't surprise you and your listeners to hear that this is one, again, of the interim goals of the techno-progressive roadmap for 2025, that we will have reached agreement on this and we will buy into it. And we want to buy into it. And even the bankers will know why they should buy into it. Because even the bankers, although professionally they're often driven by financial metrics, they are human beings too. And often they're well aware of the importance of these other sides of life. It's just that there isn't a tangible and concrete enough way of measuring it. They look at it and disdain it as a bit airy-fairy, the current stuff. So let's show people how solid and how important these measures are. And here's just finally on this, here's one evidence of how it impacts people's real lives. I mentioned again the declining health span. It's not uniform, by the way. It tends to disproportionately affect people who are living in economically deprived parts of the country. This is especially visible in North America, in the USA. Where academics such as Angus Dayton and Anne Case, a husband and wife pair of emeritus professors, they have done a lot of analysis of what parts of the society have the health span moving down as opposed to moving up. And it is people who in various ways are economically deprived, or they can no longer see the promise of economic growth from generation to generation. That tends to push them into this downward spiral, and their health gets worse because they sit too much, they eat the wrong kinds of food, yeah, sure. They listen, as it were, to the advice of Marie Antoinette, the French queen, who in the time of the French Revolution was alleged to have told her courtiers when the citizens complained they couldn't eat bread, she said, well, let them eat cake. And later she had her head cut off for being so out of touch. But nowadays, people who are economically deprived do eat cake, rather too much of it. They get addicted in the wrong kinds of drugs, the wrong kinds of alcohol, and they commit suicide. So there's a very tangible way in which these softer concerns about inequality and being left behind are feeding into people's psychology, which then is leading into bad impacts on mortality statistics. So let's make these connections clearer and more vivid, and then it will lead society to want to ask questions about that much more often than asking questions about GDP.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I could go on for hours about the declining health span in the United States, with especially white male suicide at record highs, mass despair, especially in the Rust Belt region, huge amounts of inequality. But at the same time, as you pointed out, and I wanted to mention this before, you point out the mental health issue, and in Australia, the mental health issue came down to the wire between the two major parties because it's such a big issue. They were fighting over funding, and one was saying, I have more funding than the other. It was a big issue here, because yes, there are food droughts. These where there's not classically good food. Vegetables, fruit, and veg, and some meats. In areas, but there is a McDonald's or there is a Burger King or whatever. So they have a food drought, but yeah, it all ties into mental health. It ties into this issue that they end up in a worse place, and they end up addicted to bad substances, and it ends up in a intergenerational death spiral. But you mentioned something interesting before. You mentioned about World War One, and that's another one. New levels of international flourishing. So, with techno-progressive goals, a risk of international military conflict will have been reduced by about 90%. That's really encouraging. I mean, we hear Ray Kurzweil was asked about this on stage one time, and I thought his response was great because, he said, I mean, and I agree with him. I've always said this: the world is, since World War II, the world has been a more peaceful place than mostly ever before, because most of it's micro wars, most of it's in the same sort of locations. There's, Bosnia Herzegovina, that's a little bit in Europe, whatever. Caucasus, I mean, former Russia. Most of it's in the same sort of areas, but on a whole, you survived. You were worried about getting nuked in during the Cold War. You survived that. That's why I'm a bit different than the other ones where they say you got to eliminate all nuclear weapons, because I think then you eliminate a sort of a balance of power, and you might return to conventional weapons. And I don't know how that would go. I think, like, at least I'm not for proliferation. Absolutely not. I don't want non-state actors. I don't want. We had another commentator. He's a bit loony, a bit libertarian, but he said, non-state actors or whatever. But I think a very limited amount of very rational actors, maybe superpowers or something, like the Soviet Union and the United States fought a very good Cold War. I mean, we're all still here, so that's great. But it disengages them from this conventional warfare. And I mean, this is the whole thing with the China-US relations now. I mean, what are they going to do? Throw nukes at each other? It's like it could be like this forever. And if that's it, if that's the end game where you could do one thing and they could do another, so you end up battling through war through third dimensions, I mean, that's not as bad. And so, like, on the whole, I mean, yes, military conflicts are down, and all that, but we're talking about eliminating them. You're talking about eliminating pretty much up to 90% of elimination. How do you intend to achieve that, or what is the idea around that?
So this is a hard thing to talk about. Many people will think, well, there's not much you can do about the threats of international aggression, and so let's concentrate on other things instead. Let's sort out our own backyard instead of worrying about this. But no, we do need to worry about it. It won't be the same as in the past, almost certainly. It's famously said, many militaries prepare to fight a refight of the last war, but then the future wars are usually different. And they may break out in different ways. And it won't just be by lobbing nuclear missiles overhead, probably, but it may be through cyber attacks and by perverting each other's social media and disturbing the news flow with fake news. This is very much a real possibility. Then it could be spillovers from regional conflicts. What's happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia is worrying, frankly. There's a lot of very passionate people, ideologically driven, we might even say fanatically driven people in both sides there, along with cooler, more moderate heads who are being dragged along against their better instincts. So there are threats there too. Even if I look at the UK, or rather the British Isles. In British Isles, we have the history of trouble on the island of Ireland. And when I grew up, there were terrorist outrages regularly on both sides, with Protestant paramilitaries and Republican paramilitaries. And for the last 20 20 years or so, that's been much in abeyance. There's been occasional terrorist outrages, but much fewer than before because of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, that all could unravel with Brexit. One of the unintended consequences, a consequence nobody wanted, nobody foresaw, but might happen because of ill-planned changes in our Britain's relationship with Europe. We might see a resurgence of bad feelings on Ireland, and so that could spill over again. And if there are more paramilitaries on either side that are driven by hatred and upset and emotional disquiet, who knows what they might do? Rather than blowing up buildings in London, which happened in the past, they might do something more terrible with the new weapons. So to come back, we can't ignore this question of threats from a worldwide level. We need to set goals and then think very hard about what can be done. In part, it's about helping people to realize that we're broadly the same, regardless of our perceived differences. So some greater measure of international travel will help. When people do spend time in another community, on the whole, not always, but on the whole, they can develop an appreciation for it. And they say, well, these guys speak in a funny way, but actually, you know, they are human beings too, and we shouldn't be rushing into battle with them. We shouldn't be demonizing them in some ways. So that's part of it. But part of it may also involve some, and here's a difficult topic, some better monitoring of what's going on so that we are aware of when some group is about to unleash some outrageous thing. And, well, this brings ideas of Big Brother is watching. And I think we do need some kind of watching. We do need some surveillance. Because even if 99% of the population have no such inclination, even if 99.999% of the population has no such inclination, you just need one or two really upset people to do terrible things on the worldwide stage and trigger something adverse. So we do need some better system of agreed monitoring, and that we don't have anything in place that people trust for that, and we need to build it somehow. And it's not even clear how we would build it, but we're setting this as a goal for people to talk about. I haven't done the video for that goal yet. I'm gradually working through the 15 goals and putting up short 10-minute videos that people can find on the transhumanist.org.uk site or our YouTube channel. And I'm looking forward to thinking very hard about how to express our possible solutions to this particular thorny issue in just a 10-minute video. But we transhumanists must address it. And we can't just say, well, we seem to have had a peaceful situation, because that was the same argument people raised between 1900 and 1910. People said things like, it's inconceivable that there'll be a future war. Why? Because the peoples of Europe are so deeply intertwined from an economic point of view. It was the version of the recent argument by the American writer Thomas Friedman, who said, a bit foolishly it turned out, that if two countries both have McDonald's arches in them, they don't go to war with each other. So there were similar versions of that in the early years of the last century. Somebody even got a Nobel Prize subsequently for his work on such theories. That was misleading. The roots of disquiet were there, and they were worsened by the military systems and the weaponry that was created. And with greater technology at our disposal, there will be new kinds of damage that could be raised. And it may not be fully in control. The malware that various people from North Korea unleashed on the world, such as the WannaCry ransomware, I mean, partly it was done because the North Korean state gives its hackers, who are incredibly bright and very talented often, it gives them the freedom to make money by ransomware, provided it doesn't come back and bite the North Koreans themselves. So it looks like WannaCry was released for a particular purpose, but it's very hard to foresee how these things work, and it didn't net the North Koreans much money, it turns out, and it caused unforeseen damage in ways that weren't expected. So we see more of that. We might see more of what happened with Sony Pictures, which again was the North Koreans who were upset by Sony releasing a picture portraying Kim Jong-un in unflattering light. So I can see why they're angry, frankly. It maybe was a bit of a foolish thing to release such a picture. And they brought Sony Pictures almost to its heels with this cyber attack. Just imagine what they're going to do with more powerful AI technology at their disposal if they get upset by something that Donald Trump might say. Nowadays, he's speaking favorably about Kim Jong-un. Who knows if the wind will change and he utters more remarks like he did in the past, the little rocket man, XYZ. If he says the wrong thing, if he threatens to damage North Korea in some ways, who knows what North Korea might do in retaliation. So we have to worry about these issues and we have to put them on the table. I don't know where all the answers are, but I do want them on the transhumanist discussion table.
I totally agree, and I'm going to perpetuate these ideas on this show. And when you finish your video, I'd love to have a showcase on this show if you would let me, and show that video off, I think, and go through that that video, because I think that'd be really fun, and I enjoyed that. You talk about environmental flourishing in the specific of the UK. What's that all about?
Well, you mentioned earlier the need to have a sustainable relationship to the environment. What we've done with plastics has been shocking. You know, the people who invented plastics did not envision how much damage that plastic microbeads and others could do to the ecosystems of the world. And that's one example where fairly quickly people have turned around and said, well, we're not quite sure how to fix it, but we do need to fix it. So there's 3 goals in the section of improved environmental flourishing. One of them takes a very common concern, which people are thankfully talking more about, which is the risk of runaway global warming acceleration, that the extremes of weather we're starting to see might conceivably get a lot worse a lot more quickly. And our approach there is partly technological and partly economical and partly political. The technologies to solve climate change are quite well understood, and we have seen some progress with solar and wind, geothermal and others, but it's not fast enough. We need more people researching this more quickly, and in order to encourage more research more quickly, government needs to step in and fund some of these things more often. We shouldn't just be reliant on philanthropists like Bill Gates investing in alternative nuclear fission technologies. I mean, I think there is potentially a big role for next generation nuclear power generation solving these issues too. But we need government investing in some of this. We need government also setting a proper price on negative externalities. So that if there are things that companies do which have bad consequences but they are not priced, well, of course they're going to keep on doing it. Well, it's sort of natural. So we have to set the level playing field. And many of the oil companies are actually saying, you know, let's hurry up and put a sensible carbon tax in place. But they want it to be done in a fair way across the board so that all oil companies face the same carbon tax. That's entirely right. So we should use economic incentives in the way that they have done wonders in the past. But in order for them to work, we need to have politicians setting appropriate taxes on negative externalities. We can also use the courts to take cases for damages against some of the oil companies where there is a statistical likelihood that they led to various disasters. So when BP had this disaster in the Mexican Gulf of Mexico, they were clearly responsible. And although you can't prove it maybe at a scientific level, you can prove it at a good enough level for civil damages. It's similar to how smokers eventually got lots of money out of the big tobacco companies when they were able to say, well, there's a strong likelihood and probability that these people's diseases, lung cancer and so on, were caused by the activities of big tobacco. So let's put that in place too. And finally, it needs to be political action. We need politicians around the world ensuring that goals are set and followed through, not just in a greenwash in which people say one thing but later don't act on it. So we need to hold politicians to account on this. So it's not about going back to a simpler way of life. It's not about having less flourishing. It's not about less international travel even. That's very important. We can do lots of international travel using green technology. We just need to hurry up and get that green technology in place. Electrically powered aeroplanes, systems to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere, the negative emissions technology. Some of that might simply be planting more trees. So it turns out we need to plant many more trees than is possible. So with technology, we can do better than trees. We can do, quotes, artificial trees of a sort, which are better at taking the CO2 and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So we can do all of that. But currently, there's not a business case for companies to hurry up and do it. So we need to change the subsidies in this case and get it happening more quickly.
There's so much packed into that, and I want to go through some of that, but I won't, because I want to just talk about this one issue, and it's consumption of meat from slaughtered animals will be cut by at least 90%. Well, synthetic meats and other things like that, that's really good, because humans are kind of addicted to meat. I mean, it's something you're not going to eliminate from the diet. We were talking about food droughts before, with these fast food companies that are totally, a beef patty. I mean, you're not going to get rid of it. It's not going away. It's something that's it's ingrained into the human experience now. So, tell me firstly what you mean by consumption of meat from slaughtered animals will be cut 90%. Is that because you're going to encourage synthetic meat, or are you going to ban 90%? What's your idea there?
No, it should be voluntary. Absolutely, it's something that people are going to want. They're going to realize there are some health drawbacks to eating meat as it's grown naturally. There is evidence that if we eat too much meat, especially red meat, or meat that's been processed in particular ways, it's more likely that we're going to have various health problems in the future. The people are aware of this, but they think, well, they're going to keep on eating meat anyway. But when they can see there's a better meat, alternative meat that's being grown in the labs to be just as tasty as current meat, which isn't the case currently. There are many startups in this space, and they are stage by stage having meat that is tastier and also meat that's available at lower cost. If we can accelerate these trends, then more and more people are going to say, you know what, I'm not going to eat this old, dangerously healthy meat anymore. And many people might go full vegetarian. I respect there is a strong and important strand in transhumanism that embraces vegetarianism or veganism full on. And if they supplement their vegetable diet with various add-ons, then they can live an incredibly healthy life. So maybe more people will do that. But I'm not sure that we're going to get 50% of the population doing that, at least not anytime soon. And I'm not sure it's necessary, because we can do a much better job of growing better meat using new methods. And this, compared to the current use of land, which is very inefficient. We have large amounts of land dedicated to growing vegetables of various sorts, which the cattle then eat before we slaughter them. Meat grown in labs can be something like, is well over 95% more efficient in terms of land. It's maybe 97% more efficient in terms of water use. Shortage of water is a critical environmental issue. If we do it in this alternative way, it's better all round for the environment. It frees up land, which we can then use for many other purposes. And then there is the other, I call it humanitarian principle, but it's about the sentient beings who we are slaughtering in such large scale. Maybe in the past, many things we did in the past, we now look back on and shudder, or we sent young boys up chimneys, or we smoked in social gatherings. We had smoking on the planes, smoking in railways, smoking in pubs and restaurants, and we sort of shudder. How ill-informed were we? Further back, we look at how we had slavery, and we say, oh, slavery, that was terrible. But at the time, people said, well, it's not very nice, but, that's how it has to be. We may look back in the future at our present mass slaughtering of animals and say, this was really a terrible thing that we did. And even if 99.99% of the slaughtering is painless, it only needs a very small fraction of 1% for the animal suffering to ramp up to something horrendous. So we need to move away from that, and we'll do that in part by just talking about the benefits of new kinds of food, but also by letting people experience it for themselves. And nowadays, when people experience it, they're quite interested, but they're not convinced, and they go back to eating normal slaughtered meat. But in the future, if we accelerate the work on this, I think we'll see a tipping point. And before we know it, we're going to look back on our present culinary habits and say, thank goodness we've changed.
Yeah, and we are omnivores, and I would like to see synthetic meat exported to Mars, and even if there has to be a little bit of farming on Mars. But if we get it right here, I mean, we can change the whole dynamic of how we work as a species forever more, I guess, and that's cool. So speaking of Mars, the final one here is cosmic flourishing. The UK will be part of an organization that maintains continuous human presence on Mars, and the fusion will be generating at least 1% of the energy used in the UK. So Cosmic flourishing, David Wood, UK.
So it's a bit controversial. Some people have said, why on earth are we talking about sending humans to Mars when there are so many short-term issues on the ground here on the Earth we should focus on? Some people have said we should cut these two goals out altogether because all the other 13 goals are more important. I think it's partly about raising people's horizons. It's about raising people's spirits and realizing that we're part of a much bigger universe. And I reflect back on what happened when people went to the moon in my childhood in the late 1960s. People said afterwards they went all the way to the moon and they discovered the Earth. In part because there was this pale blue dot photos, they could see the Earth as a whole. It sparked the environmental movement and caused people to change their attitudes. It was a glorious shared adventure of humanity watching the first astronauts going to the moon. I think it'll be the same thing if we go to Mars. It'll cause us to stop for a while talking about Brexit. It'll cause us for a while to stop talking about many of the other issues. It won't be Game of Thrones anymore. It will be Game of Mars, you know, and it shouldn't just be robots. Obviously, the first thing we should send to robots, and we can do this by 2025, send robots to Mars and bring them back with Martian rocks. We've often sent robots to Mars so far with the rovers. We haven't brought any of them back yet. So that's a kind of interim goal. And clearly we should also send people back to the moon, not just white males, as we've done in the past, but a whole variety of international diverse people we should be sending back to the moon as a stepping stone. And it will help us to realize our destiny is not just on the ground on the Earth. Our destiny is in a vast universe of exploration, which will take us millennia to explore, and millennia of millennia. And that's a better vision for the future rather than people saying, let's go back to how it was in perceived simpler, perceived purer times. No, the future is our destiny, it's not our past. In terms of nuclear fusion, that's an easier thing, in a sense, because people can realize that nuclear fusion would, if it worked, be tremendously impactful on our climate issues. There is so much clean energy available if we can figure out how to make nuclear fusion a reality. The controversial thing is it always seems to be 20 years in the future. It was first proposed in the 1920s by various physicists in the UK, such as, I think, Eddington. When I was at university, people would say it was 20 years in the future. Well, you know what? It is getting closer. And one thing that can bring it closer is different kinds of technology. Artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can help to solve some of the very difficult design issues of containment of these fusion reactions. It can figure out which design will allow us to tame the problems of this intense heat and magnetic fields. And it may not be the big international collaborations to come up with the goods. There are small, very interesting, more nimble startups that have got interesting ideas in this. It might be that some of them are scattered around the world. There's actually quite a few, interestingly, in the UK itself. I think there should be more public funding given to these people, not too much that it's going to overwhelm them and make them lazy or complacent, of course, but there is more funding that could be available, and the fusion might come from some of these innovative startups, perhaps in combination with the big ITER process, which is working to turn on stream later in a few decades. So that's the final goal in some sense, and I won't back off from it. I think we do need a bigger vision than just fighting in today's level. Human destiny is much, much bigger than what we have currently in mind, at least what most of us have currently in mind. That's what we transhumanists should be advocating. And we'll get there by solving our human issues along the way, particularly our social relationships and our mental health. So perhaps out of the 15, the most fundamental of the goals is this improved mental flourishing. It's called, in a sense, improving human nature. You know, our human nature has got these inherited tendencies towards divisiveness, towards in-group, out-group thinking, towards cognitive biases, towards focusing on the short term, towards abusing power if we get it. When we don't have power, we say people should be equitable. When we do get power, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt. Absolutely, not just in political power, but in social dynamics too, as we can see with what people in the Me Too movement are exposing. So arguably the most important thing to do that will help us to achieve these grander goals is to apply technologies that will help us gain the benefits of meditation, gain the benefits of yoga, gain the benefits of a spiritual retreat, but get it much faster, much more reliably with these new technologies such as psychedelic drugs, selectively applied, or nootropic drugs, and other enhancements such as an intelligent personal assistant tapping us occasionally on the shoulder and say, calm down, breathe. You might want to rephrase this as this. And many times I've been in meetings when I've been tempted to abuse other people, tell them they're the stupidest thing I've ever said. I've held my tongue. I've said it in a more diplomatic way and had very productive relationships with these people in the future. So if we have more of that on our shoulder, instead of today's social media, which is often leading us to be the worst versions of ourselves, if we have better social media in the future, we can each individually become more transhuman now, in the present, and that will help us to collaborate and get to this wonderful future of sustainable superabundance by maybe as early as 2035.
What a stirring speech, and thank you very much. And some breaking news as well, like literally like 10 hours ago, the Australian and UK space agencies, Australia just developed its own space agency here, which a political party called the Science Party had a big role in pushing for, which got the policy basically got stolen by the big parties, but they had a big role in doing it. They've just signed the Memorandum of Understanding that they're going to work together and build a space bridge, what they call a space bridge. So it's great. I mean, Australia and the UK are going to work towards this cosmic evolution, and China on nuclear fission and fusion. China is the big one pushing ahead with that massively. Not only are they bigger in green tech and building lots of trees, because they did it all in the reverse when they were developing, but now they've realized, and I think their environmental policies are going to be really interesting in the future. So we're looking to China. There's a lot of criticism about China, but you know, on this one, I'm looking to China as a world leader. Thank you very much for that stirring speech, David Wood, and you know, it's a fantastic summary, and we've got so much more to go through, but I've got to run because I've got to give up the studio space, and I've got to do that. But thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch. And yeah, if you allow me, I'll go through that video that you're producing. We'll have a look at it, and we'll promote it on this show.
There's 3 short 10-minute videos so far. I'm producing them in small chunks. So the 3 of them are already available on the Transhumanist Party UK's YouTube channel, but I can send you the links as well.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, and I'll definitely want to show them off on this show, because I think I'm not sure. That sounds awesome. That sounds really cool. And if it's the UK, I mean, UK is the mother country, and you know, so that's it. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you,
David Wood, for coming on the show. All more coming you all this week.